Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Trevor Moffat from the Improvement Service, and please be welcome to the webinar for the new Historic Environment Policy for Scotland. I will just quickly run through logistics for today's webinar, and then I'll pass over to our presenter. The first half of the session will be a presentation from HEPS staff. Then there'll be approximately 30 minutes question and answer session at the end of the presentation. To ask questions, please use the question box on the panel, which should be on the right hand side of your screen. Just type them in. Unfortunately, due to the number of people in the audience today, we can't let you speak online. So just please type in the questions, and we will pick these up and answer them during the Q&A session. You can type them in at any point, and they'll be picked up. Okay, if you have any other issues, including sound, we just please also put these in the question box, and we'll try to address them as best we can. I will now pass over to Historic Environment Scotland.
Well, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Anne McSween, Head of Casework at Historic Environment Scotland, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Don McDowell, Alistair Mackenzie, Alan Rutherford, Hazel Johnson and Dara Parsons. They're all part of the team who have been working on the policy for the last 18 months. In this presentation, I will talk to you about the new Historic Environment Policy for Scotland, which I'll refer to as HEPS. To start, we'll show a 5-minute film explaining how the policy document is laid out and how it should be used. And after that, I'll give an overview of what HEPS means for you and your work.
Welcome to our short film about the new Historic Environment Policy for Scotland. The policy was launched to the public on the 5th of April 2019, and it will be formally adopted on the 1st of May, when it will replace the current Historic Environment Scotland policy statement. This new policy has been informed by the What's Your Heritage campaign, where we ask people how historic places special to them should be recognised, valued and managed. It has also been shaped by extensive dialogue and consultation with historic environment decision makers across the sector. The previous policy statement was always intended to be an interim document put in place when Historic Environment Scotland was formed in 2015. The new strategic and high-level policy responds to feedback from stakeholders and the public that they want to see a different type of policy to inform decisions affecting our historic environment. Through this policy, we can reflect how our historic environment as a whole should be managed and cared for. It is a strategic policy document for the whole of our historic environment and is underpinned by detailed policy and guidance. It should be read alongside the two new HES documents, the Designation Policy and Selection Guidance and the Scheduled Monument Consents Policy, as well as the existing management change in the Historic Environment Guidance Notes. Two brand new guidance notes have also been published on demolition and on the use and adaptation of traditional buildings. The Historic Environment Circular, which also contains detailed processes and procedures, is also newly updated. The new policy, like its predecessors, is non-statutory, which means it is not required to be followed as a matter of law. However, it is relevant to decision making at national and local levels and should be taken into account whenever a decision will affect our historic environment. This could include plans and policies that deal with funding decisions or estate management or other specific topics such as agriculture or energy. It's also a material consideration for individual planning proposals that might affect the historic environment or require listed building or scheduled monument consent. The new Historic Environment Policy for Scotland sits alongside Scottish Government policies, plans and strategies. The new policy document contains 6 clear policies for the historic environment that will inform all decision making. The policy document has been structured to address 3 main areas: understanding and recognition, managing change, and working together. Within each of these areas there are key policies and core principles. These set out Historic Environment Scotland's understanding of how our historic environment should be managed and looked after, and explains how they should be applied. The new policy document identifies a number of challenges and opportunities that can affect how we understand manage and care for our historic environment. We know that decision making has to be sufficiently flexible and adaptable to deal with wide-ranging and ongoing changes in society and the environment. Good decisions will aim to achieve the best possible outcomes for our historic environment and maximise its benefits. We will use the policy in our decision making and the advice we give to others. You and other decision makers for the historic environment will use it in the decisions you take and the advice you provide. The Historic Environment Policy was launched to the public on the 5th of April and is now available for you to download, read and become familiar with. You should start using all the new policy documents from the 1st of May for all work related to the historic environment. The new Historic Environment Policy for Scotland is a strategic document that will guide all decision making for the whole of our historic environment. It is underpinned by detailed policy and guidance and should be read alongside these documents as they support the aims of the new policy. Its relationship to Scottish planning policy is unchanged from that of earlier policies. It will come into play on the 1st of May, after which the Historic Environment Scotland policy statement will no longer be used. For further information and downloadable versions of all the documents mentioned in this tutorial, please visit the Historic Environment Scotland website. Thank you to everyone that's contributed to the new Historic Environment Policy for Scotland and has been part of shaping the future of how we all look after our special sites and places.
In 2016, Historic Environment Scotland committed to a fundamental operational review of how we undertake our regulatory activities. We also committed to a longer-term amendment or replacement of our policy statement. As the lead public body for the historic environment in Scotland, HEPS has a responsibility to set the agenda for promoting good management of Scotland's heritage. The new policy, HEPS, reflects Historic Environment Scotland's status as the lead public body in the historic environment and follows predecessor documents, namely the Memorandum of Guidance on Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas 1998 and Detailed Guidance on Sheltered Monuments, Scottish Historic Environment Policy, SHEP 2011, and Historic Scotland Policy Statement 2016. Our experience of using the policies in HEPS and SHEP led us to conclude that there was scope to bring greater clarity, including being able to distinguish between policy and guidance. To start this review, we decided to do something a little different. As HEPS was a new organisation, we realised we had a unique opportunity to take a fundamental look at our approaches to designation, change management, and how Scotland's historic environment is looked after, recognised and valued. We wanted to demonstrate that we are open to new ways of working and to establish a compelling narrative and baseline information about what the people and communities of Scotland and stakeholders throughout the heritage sector think we ought to be doing to support the recognition and management of our historic environment. From November 2016 to March 2017, we ran the What's Your Heritage project. It was the first ever informal exchange of ideas we have had with the people of Scotland about heritage, and we have used the feedback to directly drive policy change. We asked which of Scotland's places, buildings and monuments should be designated, valued, acknowledged and celebrated. We also asked about how change to designated sites and places should be managed and what sort of development is appropriate for these special places. We had around 2,000 responses to the survey. This represents a huge response for us. To explore the findings from What's Your Heritage, we went on to speak with stakeholders and decision makers for the historic environment, and over 6 months held discussions, events and informal consultations to inform our approach and envisage what the end policy might look like. From the What's Your Heritage project and subsequent consultation, we found that a more up-to-date approach was needed for heritage protection. We went on to develop a new approach that was more inclusive and which sought to acknowledge the challenges facing those who take decisions on the historic environment every day. We undertook an initial consultation on our approach to the review and replacement of this policy in May 2018 and held a public consultation on a draft policy document between the 10th of September and the 3rd of December 2018. A report on this consultation can be found on our website. In parallel with this, revised operational information and guidance has been developed alongside the new policy document and will be in place before HEPS is withdrawn and the new policy is adopted on 1st of May. HEPS is designed to support and enable good decision-making about changes to the historic environment. Good decision-making takes into account all aspects of the historic environment and the different ways people value it. It is transparent and open to challenge and recognises that a wide range of factors can affect the historic environment in different ways. Changes might support its long-term survival, impact on its current management, or even give us new information to improve our understanding. HEPS sets out a series of principles and policies for the recognition, care, and sustainable management of the historic environment. It promotes an inclusive understanding of the value of the historic environment, encourages consistent, integrated management and decision-making to support positive outcomes for the people of Scotland, and supports everyone's participation in decisions that affect the historic environment. By doing this, HEPS helps to deliver the vision and aims of our place and time. It also takes into account principles that the UK and Scottish governments have agreed in international charters and conventions on cultural heritage and landscape. HEPS doesn't set out a new way of doing things or change the things we all care about and want to protect. The policy and guidance that sits under HEPS follows the same key principles. We wanted to make them more explicit so that anyone who cares about decisions affecting the historic environment can understand from first principles how they were made. HEPS considers decision-making and decision-makers in the widest sense, rather than being tied to one type of change, one type of decision, or one type of asset. The policy document has been structured to address three main areas. The first two, set out here, relate to understanding and recognition. HEP 1 says that decisions affecting any part of the historic environment should be informed by an inclusive understanding of its breadth and cultural significance. HEP 2 sets out that decisions affecting the historic environment should ensure that its understanding and enjoyment, as well as its benefits, are secured for present and future generations. Policies 3 and 4 relate to managing change. HEP 3 states that plans, programmes, policies and strategies, and the allocation of resources should be approached in a way that protects and promotes the historic environment. And HEP 4 sets out that changes to specific assets and their context should be managed in a way that protects the historic environment. Opportunities for enhancement should be identified where appropriate. And policies 5 and 6 relate to working together. HEP 5 states that decisions affecting the historic environment should contribute to the sustainable development of communities and places. And HEP 6 sets out that decisions affecting the historic environment should be informed by an inclusive understanding of the potential consequences for people and communities. Decision-making processes should be collaborative, open, transparent, and easy to understand. Within each of these three areas, there are key policies and core principles, which set out HES's understanding of how Scotland's historic environment should be managed and looked after, and explains how the policies should be applied. HEPS should be read alongside new HES policy documents on designation and scheduled monument consent, and also alongside new and existing managing change guidance, including our new guidance notes on use and adaptation of listed buildings and demolition of listed buildings. So, how is HEPS different from what went before? As policy for the whole of historic environment, HEPS seeks to address and influence all decisions that affect the historic environment, and has a wider scope than earlier policies and guidance, which focused more on how HES and our predecessor body, Historic Scotland, made decisions and gave advice in the planning and regulatory systems. HEPS also addresses the whole of the historic environment and provides principles for management and decision making. HEPS is for everyone with an interest in decisions that affect the historic environment. HEPS seeks to explicitly recognise the challenges and opportunities for the historic environment and promote decision making which takes account of and adapts to these challenges and opportunities. All decisions taken after May the 1st that affect the historic environment should take HEPS into account. This includes planning, land use, funding and policy. It will also apply to any appeal of decisions made under old policy. It doesn't matter how far through the procedure any decision is, HEPS will apply. The challenges and opportunities form a context for all decision makers when they are thinking about the historic environment and support new policies and principles. These include things like climate change, sustainable tourism, societal change, land management, and as you can see from this diagram, quite a few more. How does HEPS relate to other national policies, for example, Scottish planning policy, and what is its status? The Scottish Government produces national policies for addressing land use matters and decisions, including Scottish Planning Policy, SPP. HEPS has been produced by Historic Environment Scotland and complements SPP by providing a detailed and wide-ranging framework for decision-making affecting the historic environment. HEPS is the national level policy for the historic environment, so it sits alongside policies like SPP and is in line with them. It also sits above more specific policy and guidance around specific types of decision that relate to the historic environment. HEPS is a material consideration in the planning system. As already mentioned, HEPS comes into play on May 1st, after which time all decisions that affect the historic environment should take it into account. We've been asked how HEPS affects other policies in preparation. New policy decisions, for example those within local development plans, should take HEPS into account. HEPS does not, however, include any policies that conflict with previous content within HEPS, and we would expect that any amendments or updates can be addressed at the next available opportunity in the plan-making cycle. In addition to the policy and principles in HEPS, the key documents are the Scheduled Monument Consents Policy, the Designations Policy and Selection Guidance, and the Managing Change Documents on Demolition, and the Use and Adaptation of Listed Buildings. Some of the information that was in HEPS is available elsewhere as interim guidance on conservation areas and the principles of listed building consent. This interim guidance repeats the guidance on these topics that was set out in HEPS and has the same status as the Managing Change series. Following the policy changes and to ensure that HEPS's procedural information is up to date, the Historic Environment Circular has also been reviewed. The new Historic Environment Scotland Circular contains procedural information about the role of Historic Environment Scotland. So do the Managing Change Guidance notes still apply, and is there any change to their status? The answer to this is yes, they still apply, and there is no change to their status. The Managing Change series explains how to apply the policies in HEPS. Specific Managing Change notes are therefore material considerations for specific decisions and policy areas. They are referred to as key documents in the planning system in Scottish planning policy. The Managing Change series is ongoing and individual guidance notes are added, removed and reviewed over time. We consider demolition of listed buildings to be a very specific type of change and a significant loss. We therefore have specific guidance on how to apply the national level policies in this area. This is contained within a new Managing Change guidance note on demolition of listed buildings. The guidance in this document reflects the guidance as previously set out in HEPS and fulfills the same role in explaining how policy should be applied and therefore has the same status. It clarifies some specific areas, including how special interest is considered and what is expected in the marketing process. It is important to note that the policy for protection of listed buildings is set out in Scottish planning policy. Policy HEP 4 of HEPS is also a relevant consideration as it relates to any changes to a specific heritage asset. Our second new guidance note, use and adaptation of listed buildings, will also always be relevant when any significant change, including demolition, is proposed for a listed building. This new document supports, promotes, and enables the continued use and adaptation of historic buildings. The information in it is useful when considering whether reasonable efforts have been made to find a new use for a building. Overall, the functions and processes of Historic Environment Scotland have not changed. We have made a technical update to the circular to make sure that it refers to up-to-date policies and also to include the guidance on our rules and procedures. We will now move on to look at our new policies, starting with the designation policy and selection guidance. This new document sets out our policy for designating sites and places at the national level. This policy area was previously contained in HEPS and is now a standalone document which sits under HEPS. The policy sets out how we undertake our designation work, including how we involve the public in our decision-making and designation. It also provides greater clarity in areas such as how development proposals affect the designation process. There are some changes to the guidance that inform our work in selecting sites and places for designation. These are intended to reflect how our society values our most important sites and places. So what is the relationship between HEPS and designation policy and selection guidance? The designation policy and selection guidance is a separate policy document that works alongside HEPS and is informed by it. HEPS covers the whole of the historic environment and is for all decision makers. The designation policy covers a specific type of decision and work area. Its primary use is to guide our work in designation and to explain this process to anyone who has an interest in it. The criteria set out in law for designating sites and places at the national level have not changed. For listed buildings, the criterion is special architectural and historic interest. For all of the other designation work we undertake, the single criterion is national importance. This relates to scheduled monuments, gardens and designed landscapes, and battlefields. There have been some changes to the selection guidance that inform our decisions on which sites and places meet the criteria for each designation. For most designations, this means how we decide whether or not an asset is of national importance. The changes are intended to reflect how we value sites and places today. The new selection guidance sets out clearly how we consider social interest today and in the past. A good example of this relates to gardens and designed landscapes. The selection guidance gives us greater ability to reflect the artistic and historic interest that these landscapes can represent to individuals and communities today. The wording of previous selection guidance focused on their value to previous generations. For listed buildings, there has been a reorganisation of previous headings and principles for listing to better reflect the criteria of special architectural or historic interest. So how does the policy support wider public participation in decision making? One of the key principles in HEPS is to allow for greater involvement from individuals and communities in decision making processes. The new designations policy reflects our commitment to improving the way we undertake our consultation on designation decisions. Our aim is to ensure that in most cases anyone can comment on designations proposals before we make a decision. The new policy supports this. We will aim to publish all designations cases on our online portal and include a report of handling with assessment documents at the point of consultation. We're also introducing a mechanism for submitting comments at the consultation stage to HES. Our approach to designation where there are development proposals remains as before. We will normally avoid intervening unnecessarily in the planning process or other regulatory processes where there are development proposals by adding a new designation. The current guidance for designating conservation areas is in a separate interim document on our website. Local authorities are responsible for designating areas of special architectural or historic interest as conservation areas. HES will only consider doing this in exceptional circumstances. To date, HES has never designated a conservation area. We will be speaking to local authorities in the coming months about drafting a new policy and guidance for conservation areas. UNESCO is responsible for designating World Heritage Sites, and you can find selection criteria on their website. DEPA will apply the new designation policy when deciding designation appeals from 1st May. This applies to all appeals on designation, regardless of when the designation took place or when the appeal was submitted. This slide summarises the new definitions for the categories of listing A, B and C. This will not affect existing listings. As before, designating a site or place as a listed building recognises its cultural significance at a national level. Categories of listing have no legal weight, but affect how buildings are managed in the planning system. Key in this is identifying instances where we are consulted on changes to or near buildings according to their category. The new definitions for listing categories help to redress the widely held view that Category C listed buildings are of local importance only. For example, a building of special architectural or historic interest might be considered to be a representative example of its building type, period or style, and Category C will be the appropriate level of listing. However, it is equally the case that a building of special architectural or historic interest might be of outstanding importance architecturally or historically, but because of loss of fabric or later alteration, will be listed at Category C rather than Category A, reflecting the level of change. We assess the relative level of importance of a listed building on a case-by-case basis. We have also simplified the form that you can use to propose a designation. Our ongoing work includes looking at how people can comment on a designation application before we make a decision, a revision of our web pages, and how we look at local recognition. To finish with, we'll have a look at our scheduled monument consents policy. This new document sets out our policy for determining applications for consent at scheduled monuments and protected places. This policy area was previously contained in HEPS and is now a standalone document, which sits under HEPS. The Scheduled Monument Consents Policy does not represent a significant change to how we consider applications for scheduled monument consent. The main changes have involved making the policy easier to understand by using clearer language. We have also separated the aims and principles in the policy into two categories: those which apply to all decisions and those which apply to decisions we make for specific consents. Most importantly, we have distilled these aims and principles into specific policies. This will help us to explain our decision making and make it easier for others to understand. The policy contains two areas that were not covered in HEPS. Carved stone policy, this was previously a Scottish Government policy. We've now translated it directly into our own policy. And metal and mineral detection consent policy. This was previously known as Section 42 consent and did not have a policy distinct from scheduled monument consent. The new policy is set out in full in the document. The Scheduled Monuments Consents Policy is a separate policy document that works alongside HEPS and is informed by it. Its primary use is to guide our work in consents at scheduled monuments and protected places and to explain the process. So that is the end of the presentation, and we will now answer some questions which have been sent in.
We're already having quite a few questions from the audience. The first question I will pass on is, why is the guidance on conservation areas and on the principles of listed building consent interim?
Oh. Thanks. Dara Parsons here. We've produced two interim guidance documents because we have not updated this guidance yet. We're working on it. But what we've done is we've taken forward some of the guidance which was in HEPS on two specific areas of the management of heritage. One of them is the principles for listed building consent, and the other one is conservation areas, which covers designation and the demolition of unlisted buildings. We'll be working on the updates of this in line with our general updates of the Managing Change series. but the guidance does sit with managing change and carry the same status.
Okay, we have quite a few new joinees since the presentation began. If anyone has any questions, please use the question box on the dashboard to the right hand side of your screen. We'll try our best to get through them as best we can. The second question we have here, paragraph 3.47, section D, looking at significant economic or wider community benefits within the 2016 HEPS guidance. The question is, why isn't there an equivalent cited in the HEPS 2019 or within the new managing change guidance on use and adaptation of listed buildings?
Darragh Parsons again, just coming back to what I just said about the interim guidance on the principles of listed building consent. So that information, that direct wording guidance is taken forward into paragraph 15 of the interim guidance on the principles of listed building consent. What we've done is we've taken forward that those principles of listed building consent. The managing change on demolition covers specifically listed building demolition, and we'll get onto the reuse document.
Okay, our next question. We've been asked for to explain the apparent distinction in demolition of listed buildings where economic viability now sits under a separate heading from the three other considerations which are grouped under the section titled What to Consider First.
Darragh Parsons again. We tried to look at what the principal arguments usually are for the demolition of listed buildings. And normally arguments are made on grounds of economic viability. What we find though is quite often there are detailed arguments about special interest and the other two factors. So we've tried to kind of take those out and bring them to the front of the document. The first one, I suppose, special interest, because we don't think it's worth anybody's time to go through a complicated consenting process if they want to demolish a building which isn't of special interest. So we've tried to bring that right forward into people's thinking at the start of the process. They can talk to us about whether a building still meets the criteria for special interest. And if it doesn't, then they need go no further. A conservation area demolition is a separate issue, but for the purposes of listed building consent, if it's not of special interest, that's as far as they need to go. The second two things, the second one is one that is really successfully argued, but there are occasions where a building can't be meaningfully repaired. For example, when repair would include replacement of so much fabric that there's very little of the original building left. So that again doesn't need a discussion about economic viability. Third point is the same again. If significant economic benefits at a national or regional level can be demonstrated, then the issue of demonstrating building's viability is less relevant. So we've tried to just take those three factors and bring them to the front of the start of the discussion. After that, if you don't meet those three questions, then it comes on to economic viability. That's it.
Okay. The next question coming up is on designation guidance. Why would HES review or remove a designation from a site or place where there are unresolved enforcement issues?
Okay, my name is Dawn McDowell. I'm Deputy Head of Designations. I'm responsible for listing. Well, we follow the principle of not entering or undertaking regulatory processes that aren't necessary. So it would be the same as when we're deciding whether or not to assess a building or site or place for designation. But where it appears that a building or a site or a monument is not of special interest or potentially of national importance, the site or place will be removed. And that is effectively to not go through a process that's not required. But it's important to note that each case is assessed on its own merits. So it wouldn't be across the board decision to do that.
Okay, our next question. Are local planning authorities to now direct building owners or developers to the use and adaptation document before the owner or developer starts to investigate any sort of justification for demolition of a listed building?
In short, yes, that's the intention. The use and adaptations seeks to set up some of the options for looking at building to establish whether they have to establish what alternative uses there can be and what kind of adaptation is possible. Our view is that the documentation should form the basis of an assessment of whether all reasonable efforts have been made to retain a listed building. And we think that it's a useful way of structuring a discussion. It covers, for example, options like partial demolition, which even though it's not desirable, maybe more desirable than full demolition.
Okay, just before we move on to our next question, it might be worth just a reminder of who we have in the room, just so we can direct if you've any specifics to ask. So I'll just pass over to the HES staff here. If they just give me your name and role.
I'm Darryl Parsons. I'm one of the deputy heads of casework. I manage our advice on historic buildings, so listed buildings and demolition of unlisted buildings generally in the planning system.
Just that we can give a quick, remind the audience your names and your roles at HES.
I'm Alison McKenzie. I'm also Deputy Casework, and I tend to work on things like local development planning and strategic environmental assessment.
I'm Alan Rutherford. I'm Deputy Head of Designations, and I look after the scheduling programme.
Dawn McDowell, Deputy Head of Designations, and I'm in charge of the listing programme.
Okay. Our next question that's come in, if a planning authority gets an application for demolition based on an argument that a building is no longer of special interest, should it be refused, given that special interest is a question for HES, not the local planning authority? And they follow up, do you think that a reporter would stand by the refusal?
I think it's quite hard to answer that question in general terms, and I certainly won't comment on what a reporter would do with a question like that. But what we've tried to do, and we've discussed with our stakeholders, is to bring the conversation forward. So it's not, we think it would work much better if there was a discussion about special interest, if there's any doubt, if there's a discussion about special interest long before there's an application for demolition. We think that's how we want it to work. I think if an application is made and there's a good argument that a building is not of special interest, then I think that has to be taken into account, and certainly we'll consider it when we give advice on an application.
And can I just add, from designation's point of view, that we would always encourage local authorities and owners of designated sites to get in touch with us about having their sites reviewed, having a designation review for those sites, especially where significant development is proposed.
Okay, our next question. Should demolition requirements or tests apply? Apologies here, small technical issue. Okay, I'll begin again. Should demolition requirements or tests apply equally to demolition of unlisted buildings in conservation areas as to listed buildings?
What we've decided to do is to make a clear distinction between listed buildings and unlisted buildings in conservation areas, or a clearer distinction. The second of our interim guidance documents sets out the detailed guidance and principles on the demolition of unlisted buildings and conservation areas. And it's available on the Managing Change part of our website.
Just to note that links to all the relevant documents will be sent out after the webinar. Our next question, with the wider scope of HEPS, are there new groups of professions with which HES will be engaging?
It's Alison McKenzie here. Yeah, right enough. The scope of HEPS is wider than the predecessor document. I think we would expect the document to be generally more applicable across both public and private sector. I don't think there's any specific groups of professions I have in mind at the moment. I'm always happy to have conversations with anyone that's involved in making decisions for the historic environment. And as I say, yes, we think this is relevant to everybody who has a role to play in its management.
Okay, our next question. In the presentation, it was mentioned that HEPS will be applied to appeals on decisions that have already been made under existing policy contexts, i.e. HESPS. How and why can this be applied?
So that's correct. So as I said in the presentation earlier, this policy comes into effect today, so it's now the main consideration for decisions that have not yet been taken. I think the comparison we give is something like an emerging proposed plan from a local authority. That once that comes out, there's already potentially decisions in train and appeals and so on. Effectively, there has to be a point where the policy comes into effect. I think what we tried to explain earlier is that there is no huge shift in terms of the policies or principles that have come before. So we're not expecting a huge change to come about on the back of this. However, yes, as unfortunately, this is the main policy that people should be taking into account.
Okay, it was mentioned during the presentation, enabling development as a consideration in a demolition case. When do you intend to bring this enabling development guidance forward to support it?
It is something that we intend to bring forward. We I suppose on the back of this webinar and any other submissions that we get, we can prioritize accordingly. The policy in SPP, and I can't remember the exact paragraph, but that still applies, and that is a simple principle. We are certainly thinking about what kind of enabling development guidance to bring forward and what the scope of enabling development should be. There's more than one way of thinking about what enabling development is.
Okay, our next question. How quickly can you review a listing? 6 months is far too long a time frame for most developers.
Yeah, Don McDowell again. I think what we do is we look at each case on their own merits. It depends on the type of site. We'd certainly look at every case that's proposed to us, and where there is knowledge of the development that's pending, we would then prioritize as much as we can the assessment of those sites. So although 6 months is the headline of the process, there's a lot involved. If you need to go to a site visit, you research it, you enter a consultation, which is the normal process, and the consultation itself takes a number of weeks, and then there will be responses to those consultations. So that in itself takes a certain amount of time. However, we would try to give an indication of the merit where we can at an early stage and as we progress a case. So it's an open and transparent process as we progress a case. So there's just a lot involved, but we work with owners and the local authorities as closely as we can on individual cases.
Okay, our next question. Are there any plans to review the memorandum on repairs notices or urgent works to listed buildings?
At the moment, certainly one of the things that we are looking at is whether there should be guidance on dangerous buildings and how that applies to listed buildings and scheduled monuments, etc. That's something we're looking at. The Buildings at Risk toolkit contains quite a lot of information on this, and that's still all up to date. There's nothing that isn't correct in that, other than reference to Historic Scotland, etc. So we'll certainly put it in our list of potential guidance notes, but the information is there, and it doesn't require interpretation or guidance in the same way as the questions of principle.
Okay, I'm just going to pass back to Anne to give some further updates from HES.
Well, finally, we've sent some information and transitional arrangements to heads of planning, and these will also sit on our website. Over the coming weeks, we'll be looking at providing training and information to help you use HEPS in the work that you do. And please get in touch if you have any questions that haven't been addressed today. And finally, from all of us, we'd just like to say thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Okay, Trevor Moffat here from the Improvement Service. Just a few quick updates before we log out today. We're aware we were not able to answer all the questions, and we will be sending out slides with all the contact details. Some of the questions may have been too complicated to ask at this moment in time, so if we can send these to the email address that will be provided. This webinar has been recorded, and will in your email we will we'll put a link to the recording on the Partners in Planning website, and I will finally thank everyone for logging in. There will be more webinars in this planning skills series, and I'll pass out more information on the email to be sent out shortly. Thank you all very much, and goodbye.